They laughed when I dumped 400 live catfish into a dry irrigation channel instead of buying the fertilizer everyone told me I needed. That was the spring of 2019, 60 acres of dying apple trees behind me, an offer for $2.3 million sitting unsigned on my kitchen table, and 41 days left to sign it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from if you've ever had to bet everything on something nobody else believed in, and if you've ever inherited a mess wrapped up in someone else's dream. Hit like and subscribe before this gets good, because it does. 2 threats were already circling before the fish truck ever showed up. The first was a company called Meridian Highland Resorts, represented by a man named Hargrove, who wanted my grandfather's orchard drained, leveled, and turned into the back 9 of a golf course with lakeview lots, selling for $400,000 apiece. The second was smaller and meaner, a county agricultural extension officer named Dr. Voss, who had already told 3 of my neighbors, within earshot of me, that I was going to kill every fish in that channel and wastewater the whole valley didn't have. And underneath both of those, quieter, was the third thing, the thing I didn't say out loud to anyone. Whether my grandfather Silas Ashworth, dead 2 years, was actually right about anything in that leather journal of his, or whether I was about to prove, in front of everyone who'd ever known him, that grief had finally made me as foolish as they already thought I was. My grandfather bought that orchard in 1974 for $11,000, back when the valley still had water most years, and nobody had heard the words aquifer depletion outside a hearing room. 60 acres, 4,200 apple trees, a farmhouse with a tin roof that rang like a bell in hailstorms, and 6 miles of hand-dug irrigation channels that ran from the old spring intake down through every row. He worked that ground for 44 years. I have his hands in my memory before I have his face, thick-knuckled, always smelling of diesel and crushed mint, because he chewed mint leaves instead of tobacco, and swore it kept his mind clear. He raised me after my mother left when I was 9, and he never once told me he loved me in words. He told me instead, over and over, the same handful of sentences, delivered flat, like instructions. The land tells you the truth before the lab does, and slow is not the same as wrong, and don't trust a man who's never had dirt under his nails asking you what your dirt needs. The town nearest the orchard, Cedar Bend, had a population of 1,100 and a co-op way station that doubled as the only real gathering place for 40 miles, which meant that whatever happened on my 60 acres was public property within a week whether I liked it or not. I grew up sleeping in the back bedroom with the window that stuck, listening to my grandfather walk the rows before sunrise, with a lantern he refused to trade for a flashlight, because he said batteries lied to you about how much light you actually had left, and a flame didn't. He taught me to read soil by rolling it between 2 fingers before he taught me to read a book. By the time I was 12, I could tell you, just from the smell after a rain, whether the spring intake was running clean or carrying silt down from the ridge. Those are the kinds of things you don't know you've memorized until you're standing in a courthouse hallway or a banker's office trying to explain why a dead man's instincts are worth more than a current appraisal. He got sick in the winter of 2016, the kind of sick that moves in stages you tell yourself aren't as bad as they are, and by the spring of 2017 he was gone, and the estate lawyer read me a will that left me 60 acres of half-neglected trees, a mortgage he'd quietly taken out against the land in his last 2 years to cover medical costs he never told me about, and 11 ledgers I didn't open for almost 4 months because I couldn't stand the sight of his handwriting yet. When I finally did open the first one, on a night I couldn't sleep anyway, I found the fish years underlined in pencil, 1981 and 1996, with a single line beneath the second date that I've read so many times since that I can recite it without looking. Did it again. They still don't believe it works. Fine. It doesn't need them to. The valley never quite forgave him for the fish. Twice in his life, in 1981 and again in 1996, he'd stocked those same channels with live carp and catfish during the dry months, letting them root through the sediment, stir the mineral layers, and leave behind a kind of biological richness that no fertilizer bag could replicate. Both times the harvest that followed was the best in the county. Both times, within a few years, he quietened the practice. Cost, arthritis, a bad back, maybe just the exhaustion of being laughed at twice, and let the orchard slide back into ordinary chemical maintenance, until by the time he died the trees were thin-leafed, low yield, and tired, the same way half the valley's orchards were tired. He left me the deed, $4,000 in an account that emptied itself paying his hospital bills, and 11 leather-bound ledgers going back to 1975, filled with rainfall notes, soil observations, and the fish years underlined twice in pencil. Hargrove came to the farmhouse 11 days after the funeral, in shoes that cost more than my truck and had no business on gravel. Pale leather, city soles, the kind that slid a little on the porch step because they'd never once touched wet ground on purpose. He sat at my kitchen table without being asked, ran his hand once across the wood grain like he was already pricing the furniture, and slid a folder across it toward me before I'd even poured coffee. He told me Meridian was prepared to be generous with a grieving young woman. $2.3 million, 45 days to sign, water rights included in the sale, relocation costs covered as a courtesy. He talked about the golf resort like it was a gift to the valley. 120 new jobs, Lakeview lots at $400,000 apiece, a clubhouse where the barn currently stood. When I told him I needed time to think, he smiled the way men like him smile when they've already decided the outcome doesn't depend on your answer, laced his fingers together, and said the offer wouldn't improve, and neither, frankly, would the orchard, given how far it had let itself go since my grandfather stopped being able to walk the rows. He left a business card on the table on his way out, embossed, heavier than paper needed to be. I used it as a bookmark in my grandfather's ledger, in the section about the fish, and every time I opened to that page for the next 3 years, his name was right there under my thumb. Dr. Voss's first visit came 9 days after that, in a county truck with the extension office seal on the door, clean boots that had clearly never left pavement before that morning, and a laminated folder of his own tucked under one arm like a shield. He walked the dry channel bed with me, asked when I planned to resume standard fertigation protocols, and when I told him I was considering something closer to what my grandfather had done in 81 and 96, he actually laughed, a short, surprised sound, before catching himself and turning it into a cough. He told me the extension office had moved past folk remediation decades ago for good reason, that dissolved oxygen collapse in a non-flowing channel during a drought advisory could create a public health liability, and that he'd be happy to send over a proper amendment schedule instead. Nitrogen ratios, a delivery calendar, numbers he clearly trusted more than anything a dead man had scrawled in pencil. I thanked him for his time. I didn't take the folder. Walt Pruitt owned the almond ranch bordering mine to the east, and he'd known my grandfather 30 years, which didn't stop him from telling anyone who'd listen that the old man's daughter, meaning me, though I was his granddaughter, a mistake Walt made on purpose, was about to finish off what grief started. He said it at the co-op, at the diesel pump, at the volunteer fire hall pancake breakfast, always just loud enough. I heard about most of it secondhand. I never corrected him about the daughter part. I decided early that explaining myself twice to the same man was a waste of breath I might need later. Dr. Voss drove out from the extension office 9 days after I placed the order for the fish, a folder of his own under his arm, laminated charts inside it, and told me, standing at the edge of the dry channel in his clean boots, that introducing live biomass into a non-flowing irrigation structure during a state-declared water advisory was, in his words, not agricultural science, it's superstition, with a permit problem. He quoted me evaporation rates and dissolved oxygen thresholds. I told him the channel had carried fish twice before I was born, and the trees had never done better. He said anecdote wasn't data. I said I'd show him the data in 3 years. He wrote something down on his clipboard and didn't look up when he left. The truck came on a Tuesday in April, a stock tank in the bed sloshing with 400 channel catfish I'd bought with the last $4,100 in my grandfather's account, plus 600 more I borrowed against my own truck title, which meant that if the fish died, I lost the truck too. I drove that fish truck myself, because I couldn't afford to pay anyone to help me, and I released them into the dry channel bed by hand, waders up to my thighs in mud that smelled like diesel and old rain, the water barely ankle-deep in most stretches, cool enough to sting through the rubber. I could hear the fish before I could see them clearly in the murk. Small percussive splashes, then stillness, then the scrape of a tail against gravel, watching them scatter into the cracks between stones my grandfather had laid before I was born, stones I recognized from the ledger sketches, without ever having seen them exposed like that. Odell Ferris, who'd worked that orchard as a hired hand for 26 years before his knees gave out, showed up uninvited that first afternoon with a second pair of waders slung over his shoulder and didn't say much, just worked beside me for 6 hours moving stones to slow the channel flow, the way the old ledgers described, his hands moving with a certainty mine didn't have yet. Somewhere around hour 4 he finally spoke, not to reassure me, just to say the water smelled right, the way it used to smell in '96, and that was the only encouragement anybody gave me that whole week. He was the only person in the valley who didn't ask me why. By July, the water advisory tightened again, and Walt Pruitt was telling the co-op that half my fish were already belly up, which wasn't quite true. Some were, the ones that couldn't handle the shallow water, but the survivors had done exactly what the 1981 ledger said they'd do, turned the packed channel sediment over, mixed in organic matter, left behind a mineral churn that crept slowly into the root systems of the nearest rows. I could see it before anyone else could, in leaves 2 shades darker green than the rest of the orchard, in fruit set that came in heavier on the trees closest to the channel. I wrote it down every night in my own ledger, in my grandfather's same flat handwriting style, because somewhere in the last year I'd started sounding like him on the page, even when I didn't feel like him anywhere else. Some nights I sat on the porch with his last ledger open on my knees, coffee gone cold beside me, listening to the cattle bells 2 properties over, and the dry tick of the tin roof cooling after sunset, and admitted, only to the dark, that I didn't actually know if 3 years of patience would be enough before Meridian's clock ran out, or before the whole county decided I'd wasted everything he left me on dead fish and dirty water. There was one night in particular, the November the bank sent its second letter about the mortgage he'd left behind, when I sat with the ledger closed on my lap and let myself actually consider signing Hargrove's folder, not because I doubted the trees, but because I was so tired of being the only person for 40 miles who believed them. I got up, walked out to the channel in the dark with a flashlight I didn't trust any more than he had, and knelt at the edge of it long enough to hear the water moving the way it hadn't moved in decades, and I thought about the line underlined twice in pencil, "It doesn't need them to," and I understood, for the first time, that he hadn't written it as comfort. He'd written it as an order. I went back inside and didn't take the folder out of the ledger again. If you've ever had to keep working at something while everyone around you waited for you to fail, you already know the specific exhaustion I'm describing. Like and subscribe, because the next part is where it almost broke me before it started paying off. The traitorous piece of that first year didn't come from Hargrove. It came from the county water board, 3 weeks after the advisory tightened, when a formal complaint landed on my porch, in a plain government envelope, filed by a concerned neighbor, accusing me of unauthorized livestock introduction into a shared water structure during a declared drought emergency. I didn't need the filing number to know whose name would be on the complaint. Walt Pruitt's irrigation line ran off the same spring intake as mine, technically, on paper, from an easement drawn up in 1962, though his pump hadn't touched that channel in a decade, a fact he conveniently left out of the complaint. Dr. Voss was assigned to inspect and file a recommendation, and he showed up a second time that August, walking the same stretch of channel he'd laughed at 9 months earlier, taking photographs of the fish with a clipped, satisfied efficiency, the way a man documents a mistake he predicted correctly. His written recommendation, which I later obtained a copy of, used the word unscientific twice in 4 sentences and closed by suggesting the county consider the Ashworth property a candidate for mandatory remediation oversight going forward. He recommended I drain the channel and restock nothing. I sat in my truck in the extension office parking lot afterward and let myself cry exactly once, for maybe 90 seconds, forehead against the steering wheel, which was the only time in the entire ordeal I let it happen, and then I wiped my face with the heel of my hand, drove home, and reread the page where my grandfather had written, after his own losing fight with the county in 1982, "They'll ask you to prove it before it's ready to be proven. Don't. Let the ground answer for you when it's good and ready, not when they demand it." I didn't drain the channel. I paid the fine instead, $340 I genuinely could not spare, wrote the check at the kitchen table with my hand steadier than I felt, and kept the fish. The drought that broke the valley arrived the following August, worse than anything in 40 years of county records. Reservoir levels down to 19%, wells failing across 3 townships, irrigation districts issuing shutoff notices in the order they'd once issued planting bulletins. Walt Pruitt's almond ranch, irrigated the conventional way with deep well pumps running dry by September, lost 31% of his trees outright and saw yields on the survivors crater by more than half. I heard later that he stood at his own dead rows in October and didn't say a word to the county inspector who came to assess disaster relief eligibility. 6 other orchards along the eastern flats reported similar losses, and by harvest, the co-op was fielding calls from growers asking whether the whole district would qualify for emergency aid. My 60 acres, running on a fraction of the water everyone else used because 3 years of catfish churning through that sediment had turned the channel soil into something that held moisture the way a sponge holds water instead of shedding it the way packed dead ground does, lost 4 trees. 4 out of 4,200. I walked those rows in September with my hand on bark that should have been cracking and wasn't, leaves that should have curled and hadn't, and I didn't call anyone to tell them, because I'd learned by then that the numbers would do the talking better than I ever could. My yield that October came in at 18,200 pounds of fruit per acre, against a county average, in a drought year, of just under 6,000. The co-op's own posted numbers, not mine, put the figure up on the chalkboard at the harvest weigh station, where every grower in the valley came to log their totals, the same board Walt Pruitt had stood in front of for 30 years, without ever once glancing at my grandfather's line. That's where it happened, at the weigh station, the 2nd week of October, 3 years and 6 months after the fish truck first pulled up my driveway. The co-op posts every grower's yield on a public chalkboard as trucks come through, a tradition older than most of the people reading it. Chalk dust on the manager's hands, the smell of crushed fruit and diesel exhaust thick in the loading bay. By mid-afternoon, a crowd had gathered around a number that didn't make sense to anyone standing there. Mine, more than triple the valley average, in the driest year the extension office had ever recorded. Somebody asked out loud if the manager had made an error transcribing it. He hadn't. I stood off to the side near my truck, arms crossed, saying nothing, letting the number do exactly what my grandfather always said the ground would eventually do on its own. Dr. Voss was at the weigh station that day, doing his usual advisory rounds with his usual clipboard, and I watched him walk over to the board, read the figure twice, glance at the county average chalked beside it, and say nothing at all. No laminated folder this time, no laughing, just a long stillness that from him was closer to an admission than any words would have been. Walt Pruitt stood near the back of the crowd with his own numbers already logged, down 54%, his hat pulled low, and for the first time in 3 years, he didn't have anything to say to anyone, loud or otherwise. A woman I didn't recognize, a reporter from the regional farm bulletin who'd come out to cover drought losses, asked me directly, in front of everyone, what I'd done differently. I told her 3 words: fish, patience, water, and let her fill in the rest from the co-op's own chalkboard, because I'd decided a long time before that morning that I would never explain myself twice. Hargrove came back 9 days after that, in the same expensive shoes, a little more scuffed than the first time, except now Meridian's golf resort financing had collapsed along with half the region's water allocations, and the only orchard left in the valley that hadn't lost a season of production was mine, the same water rights he'd wanted folded into his original offer, worth considerably more now that half the district's wells were rationed and the county was drawing up its first mandatory cutback schedule in decades. He didn't sit down uninvited this time. He knocked, waited on the porch until I opened the door myself, and asked, in a voice that had lost most of its earlier ease, if we could talk about a water-sharing lease instead of a sale, at a rate nearly 4 times his original per-acre offer. I let him wait in my kitchen for 11 minutes while I finished writing in my ledger, because I finally had the time to make him wait, and because some part of me wanted him to sit at that same table a second time and understand exactly how far the ground had shifted under him. Then I told him the terms would be mine, in writing, reviewed by my own lawyer, non-negotiable on the water rights themselves, which would never leave my name. Meridian sent their attorney, a sharp, unhurried woman named Reyes, to smooth over the details of what she assumed would be a simple signature, and found instead a woman who had spent 3 years reading 44 years of her grandfather's handwriting and wasn't interested in smoothing anything. Reyes tried, in our first meeting, the same condescension Voss had used, referring to my method as an interesting folk approach that Meridian was willing to accommodate, until I placed all 11 of my grandfather's ledgers on the table between us, alongside 3 years of my own, and asked her which specific line item in her firm's financial models she wanted to compare against 44 years of documented yield. She didn't bring up the word folk again. We negotiated for 6 weeks, through 4 drafts and one moment where she tried to slip a right of first refusal clause into paragraph 9 that would have given Meridian an option on the land itself if I ever chose to sell, which I caught, struck out in red pen, and initialed myself before sending it back. I got the lease I wanted in the end, structured entirely on my terms, generating more annual income than the original $2.3 million sale ever would have across even a modest number of years, with the land, the water, and the ledgers staying exactly where they belonged. 10 years passed after that October at the way station. Hargrove's lease renewed twice, always on my terms, the per-acre rate climbing each time as the district's water grew scarcer and more valuable. And the man himself, I heard, left Meridian for a smaller firm 2 years after our negotiation, and once told a colleague, who later told Odell, who told me, that the Ashworth Orchard was the only deal of his career he was ever glad he lost the first round of. Dr. Voss retired from the extension office 6 years later, quietly, without the send-off most retiring officers got, and the department he left behind eventually added a line to its official soil health guidance, acknowledging biological channel restoration as a legitimate low-input remediation technique in water-stressed orchard systems. No names attached, no apology issued, but I know whose photocopied ledger pages sat in a drawer at that office by then, dog-eared from being pulled out and referenced more than anyone there would admit out loud. Walt Pruitt sold his almond ranch in the 8th year, after 2 more bad drought seasons broke what the first one started, and moved to be near his daughter 2 counties over. He never apologized, not directly, men like him rarely do, but the spring before he sold, he came by my fence line at dusk, hat in hand, and asked, almost gently, if I'd walk him through what I'd actually done with the channels, and I did, because by then there wasn't any use holding on to it, and because my grandfather never once refused to teach a man who finally showed up ready to listen. I never sold the water rights, never franchised the method, never let a single investor turn it into a product with my name stamped on a bag of something, no matter how many offers came after the regional bulletin ran its story. I expanded slowly instead. 80 more acres by year 12, 4 more channels stocked and matured over the following decade. A small informal partnership with 2 younger growers in the valley who came to me instead of the extension office when their own trees started thinning. Sitting at my kitchen table asking the same questions I once asked a leather ledger in the dark. 22 years after that fish truck first pulled into my driveway, I sat my grandniece down at the same kitchen table where Hargrove once left his business card, and I handed her 11 of my grandfather's ledgers and 9 of my own, the newest ink barely dry, the leather covers worn soft in the same places his hands had worn them, and told her the same 6 words he told me before I understood what they'd cost, or what they'd give me back. Slow is not the same as wrong. She's 26 now, standing exactly where I stood, deciding whether to believe an old woman's dirty water over a clean man's clean offer. I think about that decision every single day I walk those channels. Boots in mud, that still smells the same way it did the spring. I nearly lost my truck to 400 catfish. What would you have done in that kitchen at 24 with $4,000 and a dead man's fish story? And how long would you have let them laugh before you found out you were the one who was right the whole time? Because 3 years after the fish, the water board came back to my door with a different kind of letter altogether. Sealed, official, nothing like the fine notice I'd already paid once. And that one changed everything I thought I understood about what my grandfather had actually buried in that last ledger.
Mm-hmm.